Hi, I'm James, and in today's video I'm taking a look at this, which is the new, for the second half of 2021, Dell Inspiron 3510 laptop. And this is the absolute base spec model, so the Intel Celeron N4020 with 4GB of RAM, 128GB SSD, and a 1366 by 768 TN display. Now, I've picked up this machine because it's quite interesting to just sometimes look at the absolute entry level from a manufacturer. The older 3502 is technically still available here on the Dell UK website, but not for next day delivery. It's quite a long lead time on that model, whereas the 3510 is available for next day delivery at the moment, and it's fairly safe to assume that the 3502 will be phased out soon. One thing which I have found slightly disappointing with the 3510, just from a technical perspective, is that they haven't taken the chance to upgrade away from the old Gemini Lake refresh based N4020. The Jasper Lake based Celeron N4500 is out now, was launched earlier in the year, and it would have been nice to see that, as that offers some nice newer features such as PCI 3 support, updated processor and graphics cores, and generally higher performance. But Dell have chosen to stick with the Gemini Lake, which does date back originally to around 2017. This means the main update versus the previous 3502 model is actually in the chassis itself. The system is 1mm thinner, 5mm narrower, and 14mm shallower, so the actual footprint of the machine, while retaining that 15.6-inch display, has been shrunk a little, so the machine is physically slightly smaller. The downsides of this, I will look at the ports in a second. You do get a slightly smaller battery, albeit only 41 watt hours instead of 42 in the older model, and slightly strangely the machine is listed as being 80 grams heavier, despite that shrink in footprint. So whether they've strengthened some things inside and that's led to that increased weight, I'm not too sure, but just worth bearing in mind. It is worth noting the 3510 is also offered with a Intel Pentium Silver N5030. This is a quad-core Gemini Lake refresh chip, so still the same architecture as the equivalent 3502 again, but does bring some improvements, notably that you get a 1080p WVGA screen with that model. Turning our attention to the ports and looking down this side, we will see, so the left side of the device, we will see we have our charger with power indicator. We have an HDMI 1.4 port, so this is good for 1080p 60Hz output. We have a pair of USB 3.2 Gen 1 5 gigabits per second ports, which we can both see are marked as super speed on here. And then looking on the right hand side, we have a headphone jack, USB 2 port, so if you're using storage devices, make sure to use the left side ports, and an SD card reader. Now, compared to the previous generation 3502, we lose an Ethernet port and a Kensington lock. So if you need to lock the machine to a desk, then again this model loses that port, and if you make use of that Ethernet adapter jack, you're going to have to start using a USB one instead. Not an issue for most people, particularly with a fairly basic machine, but worth noting. We also see when we open the screen, this portion of the hinge here will lift the device slightly off the surface to aid with cooling. Turning our attention to inside the laptop, and we have a fairly standard plastic chassis. This is called carbon black, so a slightly different colour to the previous generation 3502, and I believe Dell say that this uses some recycled plastic in as well to reduce sort of what is going to landfill. Unfortunately, I don't know sort of the mix of plastic in that, but it's nice to know if that is the case. In terms of the feel, I don't think it's too bad. It is very lightly textured. There's enough there to give you a little bit of grip to the machine. It's not super smooth, but it's also not like a very moulded in texture to it. Some of them you find where they're quite a bumpy surface. You don't have lumps that you're running your finger across. The keyboard itself, being the entry-level system, there is no backlit keyboard here. There is a connector on the main board for a keyboard backlight, so it's possible this is offered in some configurations in some regions, but here in the UK, every model that I looked at was without a backlight on the keyboard. You also get just a regular power button and not the fingerprint sensor which Dell offer on a lot of their models now. I quite like that just for ease of logging in and authorising certain things on the machine with Windows Hello. Other things to note, so the actual use of the keyboard, I've had no real issues with this. I like Dell's UK English layouts. The function keys, obviously, as standard, operate as sort of volume adjustment, brightness, media controls and so on. These ones, print screen, home, end. You can invert that in the BIOS. Being a 15.6 inch laptop, we have numpad on the right hand side, including a dedicated calculator button. So my wife's an accountant and she would love that feature. We also have, so although it's not documented, so function and the up and down keys is page up and down, and left and right functions as home and end. Some keyboards don't feature this, including some Dells, weirdly, and it always winds me up when they don't have that because I don't like going up here for the home and ends when my hands are low down on the keyboard. The touchpad, centred with the keyboard itself, so slightly offset in the chassis, as you'd expect for a 15.6 inch width touchpad. It's fairly large. Again, I've not had any issues with this. It seems good, responsive. There's quite a nice feel, even though the laptop is brand new. I only received it today. So yes, not bad at all. Fit and finish on the machine as well is pretty good. I haven't found anything loose or which feels particularly flexible on it. So for a base level chassis, this is not bad. Actually, even the tolerances on the base panel are quite tight. I've already taken that off just to have a look inside, and it was surprisingly difficult for a basic machine to get the pry tool in place, just because the tolerances do seem quite good on that. Looking at the screen, and this is really going to be one of the weak points, particularly on this Celeron based model, we can see that Dell have made an effort. So where the machine has lost that depth and width, the side bezels have been thinned slightly, a couple millimetres on each side, and also the chin at the bottom of the laptop has got a lot smaller than the sort of 3501, 3502 models, which had quite a large, almost an extra centimetre down there, maybe even a tiny bit more. And to the extent they've actually omitted the Dell logo that used to be at the bottom of the screen on the older 3000 series models. So that improves the sort of screen to body ratio of the front of the laptop. So that improves the screen to body ratio of the display assembly, and means the screen fills the area more while your laptop is more compact. It is worth noting we have the webcam up here. However, unlike some models, there is no privacy filter on that. We also have a mono microphone up here, but if you want to cover the microphone, you're going to need a bit of tape or something to do that. There is no sliding filter. You can disable it in the BIOS, but that's a little more difficult for the average user. The panel itself is a TN type panel with a pretty poor 1366 by 768 resolution. Not really something I like to see in 2021, but again, this is the most basic laptop that Dell sell, really. That low resolution means you don't have the sort of nice font smoothing effects, because there is just no scaling happening on this display. And looking at a few holiday shots on here, so we can see when actually looks possibly better on the camera than it does in reality. So Contrast isn't great, brightness isn't great, so you find that blacks are a bit on the grey side because the backlight's turned right up, so you don't have great contrast between the dark and bright areas. And also, just as we start, so side to side there's quite a bit of colour shift, but not terrible, but vertically it's, again, the camera actually makes it look a bit better than it is, but when you start moving above or side to side on this screen, and particularly below, it really struggles with the quality of its quality reproduction at any kind of off-center viewing angle. Viewed dead on, it's usable. I certainly wouldn't recommend it for the screen. And the Pentium-based models with that 1080p WVA type panel will be a lot better, even though the brightness and colour gamut remains 220 nits and 45% of NTSC. But just being the superior panel technology, it should be a lot better. So a definite weak point on this machine. The screen is really where the low cost shows, even above the use of the Gemini Lake processor. Turning our attention to the Windows 10 install, and from pressing the power button, there is a bit of a delay between the actual initial press and the first post of the machine, so you see there's around 5 seconds to there. We then begin loading Windows 10, and to the desktop is so there we go. So from pressing the button to the desktop on this, which is a completely clean install, 22 seconds. Not spectacular, but not horrific either. Because we have the SSD as standard on these, there are models available here in the UK which use a mechanical hard drive. I would not recommend those at all. They will be pretty horrible. But looking at the Windows 10 install, so we have Windows 10 Home in S mode, and it ships with 20H2, so not the latest 21H1 image, a slightly older version, but that will of course update automatically, and no reason there should be any issues with that. Looking at sort of pre-installed software, and again, because this is in S mode, you don't have too much. You have the Dell Cinema Color, Customer Connect, Mobile, and McAfee is there. McAfee does not run in S mode. However, so you use Windows Defender as your antivirus. If you take the system out of S mode, it will activate a trial of McAfee. And then we have some more Dell software, Partner Promo, which I believe is advertising Dropbox or similar. So a few bits which you may choose to remove, but because it is shipping in that S mode, there's not a huge amount of pre-installed software. You can of course opt out of S mode for free, and if you want to use the machine sort of fully unlocked, or as I'm going to do shortly, reinstall Windows 10 in the fully functional mode rather than locked to using Windows Store or Microsoft Store applications. So nothing too objectionable on the standard install, fairly standard for what you'd expect from a machine shipping with Windows 10 S mode. Taking a quick look at CPU Z to check some of the other hardware details, we can see, so we have the Celeron N4020 here, and we can confirm the DDR4 memory module, only one in a single channel configuration, and despite the fact there is a DDR4 3200 module installed, this runs at 2400. This is actually lower than the Gemini Lake chip supports, so Dell have chosen to limit that to 2400, even though a much faster module is installed. So if you're swapping out the modules, you would only really need to buy a DDR4 2400 module. I wouldn't worry too much on speed otherwise, because it's always going to run at that lower specification speed. Looking elsewhere, and we can see, so running a short test on our SSD, we're going to run sequential test. The 128GB SSD is an NVMe type drive, however I wouldn't really be expecting stellar performance. given the low capacity and budget nature of this machine. Even so, we do get over 1 GB per second read speed, and for the write speed, a less impressive 400 megabytes per second. However, that read speed is still quite a bit quicker than your traditional SATA SSD can achieve, being limited by the interface to around 560 megabytes per second. And finally, we are going to look just on the thermals. This machine is always silent in operation, as there is no fan inside the chassis, and the processor only uses a maximum of 6 watts. So running Prime 95 in its maximum power consumption test and looking at temperatures here, we can see even while turboing we're using a maximum of sort of 7-8 watts of power. Temperatures are rising up to around 70 degrees for the package. However, this will never be accompanied by fan noise because there is no active cooling in the chassis. It instead relies solely on convection, with air just venting out here through these little vents and coming in through the base, but the air is just being drawn through by the fact that it is heating up. There is no fan pushing it around. As it is, I would expect that to probably drop down to sort of 6 watts after some sustained usage, and it should be able to regulate the temperature just about with that level of cooling. In reality, with a machine like this, you aren't really going to be asking for sustained high performance from it. If you were demanding that, you're really better off getting something Core i3 based or even Pentium Gold, as these Celerons are really not particularly high performance systems. The benefit of this, however, is a relatively good battery life. Despite the fact I've been using this with full screen brightness and running CPU torture tests and other things on it, it's still estimating around 3.5 hours of battery life remaining with just over half the battery. In reality, I think for general usage you could probably expect sort of 7 to 8 hours, particularly if you are a bit more careful with the screen brightness and other things. So although not stellar battery life, it's not going to be an all-day battery. Considering the relatively low battery capacity of this machine, it will last a fairly long time. With light usage, you may get another hour or two out of that, maybe even more. Of course, one thing which is going to be asked now, with it just around the corner, is whether the device is compatible with Windows 11. As you would expect, this meets the requirements on the processor and on the TPM 2.0 specification. So I believe Dell do state on their website that Windows 11 is an upgrade option on these, and it will be upgradable, but looking at this I can see no reason why that wouldn't be possible. Obviously, because you've got fairly limited SSD space, if you start loading a lot onto this machine you might find it actually tricky to do the the Windows 11 upgrade, but as long as you have, I think it's probably about 20 gigabytes free, you should be able to get that done without issue. General performance of the system, and for basic usage like web browsing, email, although it is not a powerhouse with that Gemini Lake dual core chip, the relatively fast SSD means it is still fairly snappy when it comes to loading applications. You're not going to have any real issues with web browsing, email, basic document writing and so on. The wireless is actually a relatively good Intel 9462 Wi-Fi adapter, which supports 802.11ac but not 802.11ax or Wi-Fi 6. Using the laptop for things like video playback, and even playing the highest quality 4K version of a file on YouTube. Obviously this is way higher than the screen can display, but we are still decoding that full quality version. And if we check the stats for nerds, we can see we are decoding a 4K 60Hz video here, and the QuickSync engine on this can do that no problem at all. We are getting very little in the way of frame drops. There are occasional ones, but you know, overall not an issue playing back 4K content on here. The video offload engine will handle that just fine. So if you're looking to play Netflix, YouTube, Amazon Prime, these should all be handled without issue at all. Turning our attention to gaming performance, and really again with this combination of the Gemini Lake Celeron with Intel HD 600 graphics and 4GB of RAM in a single channel configuration, this is never going to be a great experience. You will find sort of casual games will run, but really you're looking at very basic titles. We have the very fun mini motorways here. And even, you know, looking on this, we will see even, you know, for a fairly simple, albeit Unity based 2D game like this, we aren't even getting 60 frames per second here with the most basic map possible. We're just getting you know, sort of 40-30 frames per second, and it would be realistic to expect this to drop off further as the game gets more complex. Similarly, looking at a recent re-release, the remastered version of the original Quake, and this will start up with 4GB of RAM. So even running this with the you know, at the native 1366 by 768 of the display, even, you know, what is a fairly old game, albeit updated somewhat, this is in places reaching 60 frames per second, but often dropping into the 40s or 50s, and you could expect this to drop further in demanding areas. So this is really a, you know, system on a chip and memory configuration which is really going to struggle with anything beyond the sort of most basic games. This is arguably playable, but for a very fast-paced action game, you may find as frame rates sort of go 30 frames per second and below, you'll be at a definite disadvantage, particularly in the multiplayer. Looking at a more demanding title like Fortnite, and you can see here we are using the absolute maximum performance settings, so very low rendering resolution, minimal detailing, and the alpha performance renderer. Having then loaded into the game, and in the initial staging area we can see performance is really pretty poor. So we are at times getting 20 frames per second. We've gone up into the balloon, or the bus I should say, and here over the map we're getting, you know, 10 frames per second as we sort of fall up to 20, but we're getting a lot of pauses, a lot of hitches, and to be honest, in a game like this, this is just going to render you absolute dead meat. So even on the absolute minimum detail settings, the combination of this processor and the single channel memory, and particularly only 4GB of memory, just gives you a completely unplayable experience. You know, having, you know, largely single, sometimes, well, it's very variable frame rate as well. Really trying to achieve anything is going to be extremely difficult. Here we've got now glitching where, you know, terrain hasn't loaded in properly, the game is now pausing, a character disappeared through the landscape because we're just waiting for all of this to load in. And yeah, for gaming like this, I mean, really you need to be looking at a higher class of laptop. This is simply not going to be suitable. Our time of day has just completely changed. So we can see just not in any way a fun or playable experience. While the game may technically work, we're just going to get absolutely destroyed. I think I'm being matched up with bots here because I don't typically play this game much. But yeah, you are in no way going to have a good time playing this. So testing with the webcam, and even in what is a fairly brightly lit room, there's still quite a bit of noise in the image. The microphone's also obviously mono, and there is a fairly tinny sort of sound to it. It's not a great quality item, but really this is what you'd expect from this class of machine. It's a 30 frames per second 720p webcam and mono microphone. As noted, there is no privacy cover for that camera. There is a little indicator light which tells us when it is in use, but there's no sliding cover to block it off when it's being used. Looking at an upgrade and repairability perspective, So there are some options to improve the specification of this laptop if you already have it, or if you are looking at buying one to customise. So the DDR4 memory is a single SODIMM slot here. There is not a second SLODIMM slot, so you cannot add additional module or use a dual channel memory configuration, but that can easily be replaced, as can the SSD. This is an NVMe type device, and this has a holder for the M2 2230 size drive, or you can remove that holder and fit a full-length M2 2280 drive. There is also here, we have screws, mounting bracket and cable for attaching a SATA hard drive or SSD. So if you did want to upgrade the system with a second drive, that can be done, and Dell have included inside the system everything you need to do that. Getting into the system is also relatively easy. It's actually just a case of 9 screws and gently prying it open with a pry tool. I will be posting a video in the coming days of how to do that. In terms of repairability, so the DC jack, if that was to get damaged, something you do see fairly commonly, that is on a cable here. It involves lifting that hinge up, but that can be replaced. Battery can fairly easily be replaced with a few screws and just pulling that out there and transferring the cable onto the new one. The keyboard is part of the Palmrest, so in order to replace a keyboard, if that gets a liquid spill or something, you would be looking at basically transplanting the whole machine into a new keyboard base, and those can be fairly expensive. Once the machine is a few years old, you may find it's uneconomical to do so. And the screen is stuck in with adhesive strips, so getting the bezel off shouldn't be too difficult. I haven't tried it myself yet, but you've got some strips that you can pull to release the screen. Not as easy as sort of the older models where they had screw fitments, and also makes refitting and alignment a bit trickier. And the panels are weirdly expensive for this. Actually, the full HD one is cheaper than the low res one. When I was looking at my suppliers earlier, I was looking at upgrading this to a 1080p panel, but it would actually be cheaper to return it and just buy the Pentium one with one already fitted, as the panel was quite expensive on its own. So reasonable repairability and upgradability. We can see we have no fan here, just passive cooling as well. So you shouldn't really need to clean that cooler out because it shouldn't be suffering from excessive build-up of dust. So overall, would I recommend the Dell Inspiron 153510? Well, in Celeron guise with that 1366 by 768 panel, no. Even at the £260 I paid with discount code, it's just under £300 without. Really, you can do better, either by going to the Dell outlet or by looking at somewhere like Laptop Outlet Direct, which I recently bought a Core i3 IPS screened Acer for, I believe, £250, again with the discount code on eBay, but that just blows this away in terms of processor performance, screen quality, graphics performance. You know, if you really must have a new machine under £300, sure, it's an option, but I'd say either up your budget or just consider going the nearly new or refurb open box route, because you might get better value for money. It's a really tight price point and you can do better than this, really. Even considering the Pentium version, I think that is possibly a little expensive at an additional, I believe, £80 over this. You can get the 3502 with the Pentium and the 1080p screen, obviously the slightly larger chassis, which I believe comes in about £30 more than I paid for this. But again, you know, you can probably get better options out there. The 3502 now does have quite a long lead time on it if you order one, and I don't think the Pentium version of the 3510 at the time of recording represents good value. So I hope you found this video useful. Do let me know in the comments if you've got any questions. Hit like if it's helped you, and hit subscribe if you'd like to see more videos as we post them. Thanks for watching.